Bona tarda. Good evening. For me, it's a great pleasure today to introduce you our speaker. Our speaker, Diana Kurkovsky-West. Many of you already know her, and you know about her abilities, her intelligence, and her knowledge, the brilliance of her ideas. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to share with her this vision about one of the most, I would say, successful attempts to think about a new city. This successful attempt, which is the Microrayon, which in Russian means micro-district, is probably the most enduring and the largest example of application of the modern principles of city making in the world. They were not only limited to the Soviet Union itself, but also to all the satellites of the Soviet Union. And as we will see later, they permeated through other experiences also in the West. Microrayon is basically a district in which, a self-sufficient district in which 5,000 to 10,000 inhabitants, depending on the model, share space, share public space, share also productive activities, and they have educational facilities as well included in the district. So, in a way, it's the attempt of embodying the main basic ideas of the modern movement about the modern city, doing that with a social edge to it. Not only that, but also in terms of urban situation, in many cases, microrayons were built after the public transport system was built. Microrayons started to be built after the metro stations were built, in many cases. So there is a comprehensive, holistic view about how to connect these new neighborhoods with existing urban fabric. They were based basically several models. They were, Diana will tell us later much more in detail about that, different models, different constructive systems, different industrialization systems, but they all refer to this idea of creating a building for the masses as quick as possible. And Khrushchev, who was one of the main ideologists behind the idea of the microrayon and industrialization, was the one that started the whole process. Of course, the images they conveyed, they imagined for these neighborhoods were, you know, up to the global standards. I mean, this could be a Swiss neighborhood nowadays. Or this one, they could be a very sort of typologies that you can find everywhere in Central Europe, for instance. But this is not only, for me, the main interest of the microrayon. It is actually the sheer size of the areas that microrayon is covering, especially in Russia nowadays. This is St. Petersburg, and this is the old center, which is very compact, and as you know, started in the 18th century, basically built around the 19th century, and the other areas, the other yellow areas are all microrayon areas where people started living there after the Second World War, mostly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The other non-colored areas are industrial areas. So they suppose they were a sort of counter-image to the existing bourgeois city. To that compact city, they proposed the Microrayon. This is another part of St. Petersburg. Of course, the materiality of the buildings themselves, the quality of the public spaces were very often not up to the original ideas. The size of the apartments were very small. Many people started imagining different ways of enlarging the apartment, etc. But still, the quality of the interaction, the quality of the connections between the several pieces forming the Microrayon is still now very good. And it is actually, for us, for those who have known a little bit about these neighborhoods, it has been a very, a discovery and actually a realization of how much potential, the potentiality of the Microrayon to be developed further. Even beyond the necessity of the transformation, or precisely because of that, microrayons are very capable of being transformed without negating, without cancelling the original ideas behind them. But now they are being cancelled. In many places around Russia, the neighborhoods, microrayon neighborhoods are being, are in decay, they are substituted by new developments without the social edge and just creating environments, dormitory towns, environments without the complexity of relationships that microrayons implied. And this is a process that is actually now a bit stopped. It accelerated in the 90s. Now, with the current crisis, is possibly a moment to reflect on that, to try to change this direction of events, and try to reconsider microrayon as an opportunity for change. The idea of microrayon actually permeated beyond the Soviet Union, as I said before, and in this example of mass housing construction, which is Velvidje, we can have one of the examples of the idea that in a way was permeating beyond ideological barriers, beyond political circumstances, into the construction of the modern city. Diana will talk about the relationship between housing and cybernetics. Cybernetics, for a Batesonian like myself, the idea of cybernetics is profoundly central to whatever I try to think about. And it implies the idea of system, which is crucial if we think about the city as an organism. It implies the idea of control, which is also, or order, which is also important if we want to have a coherent functioning of the ensemble. But it also, as I said, as a Batesian, for me it's very important, it implies also the idea of form, the idea of patterns that connect, the idea that systems are not without form. And I hope Diana will tell us more about this. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, and thank you for coming and for having me here. I very much appreciate the fact that this is not a time that ordinarily people take to go to talks, especially talks about Soviet housing. It's Friday night. You all want to be somewhere else. So I very much appreciate you being here. I do need to switch into my presentation, though. 1 second. Oh. It's good. Thank you. So the material I'm about to present is actually something that is partly work in progress, because I'm working on a book project that deals with cybernetics in the Soviet Union, in particular with planning and the intersection between planning and cybernetics, and it has a design component to it. It has an interior design component to it. I'm going to mostly talk about the Microrayon piece of the puzzle today, but I'm also happy to tell you a little bit more about the other pieces of this project if you're interested. Also, since we are a nice, not too small, but sort of a nice group, if you have questions as I'm speaking, please feel free to interrupt and ask them, because I think that creates for a nicer interaction. So, without further ado, I wanted to actually begin with a couple of cartoons. These were cartoons created by, actually, there's a group of 3 very famous cartoonists who satirized all kinds of current events in the Soviet Union that were very well known and published in a magazine called Krokodil. So these are some cartoons from Krokodil, addressing the subject of Soviet housing. And as you can see, the Soviets themselves already in the 1960s were fully aware of what we know now, which is that sometimes there is a certain impression of monotone environment in these kinds of Microrayon. So, here you have a guy asking a policeman to help him find the Institute of Standardized Planning. Here you have an even more disturbing situation, because there's a poor soul sitting there without an apartment, without a roof over his head, and an entire apartment block unit has been extracted, and the neighbors are gossiping that his wife left him and took the apartment with her. And of course, what this is actually referring to is something that was part of the sort of late 50s planning or building practice with these Microrayon, with these prefabricated buildings, was that they were actually assembled with entire apartment blocks. And I will get a little bit more into the differences between, or among actually, because there are many different kinds of construction for these buildings, but this is kind of a canonical one of the early series called the K7, and it was created by essentially just lifting entire prefabricated apartments into place. So as you can see, it's not necessarily only abroad that there's a certain drab reputation that these kinds of buildings have, but also already in the Soviet Union there was quite a bit of humor associated with the fact that these Microrayon were rapidly proliferating throughout the country, starting with the 1950s, starting with the late 1950s and Khrushchev's call to create housing on an industrial scale. These are stills from a film, a very famous film that every Russian basically has watched, because it comes on TV before New Year's every year, time and time again. It's unavoidable, right? And essentially the plot of the movie is based on the fact that, all these buildings are the same. What happens is, as you can see on the top corner here, oh, nope, boy, I have killed the whole thing. Okay, and the upper, there you go. So in this slide, he's drinking with his buddies. He goes to the sauna, to the banya, common practice before New Year's, before coming home to celebrate with his fiancée, or a woman he's about to propose to, the protagonist. And they got extremely drunk, and one of the friends, not the main protagonist, is supposed to fly to Leningrad that evening to be with his wife. But basically they're so drunk that the wrong guy gets on the plane. And the wrong guy essentially wakes up in Leningrad. He has no idea he has flown or traveled. He's not sure why he's at the airport. He's still extremely inebriated. He gets in the car, in the taxi. He calls out an address. The address is 3rd Builder Street, house number 25, apartment 12, and it takes him to the identical apartment building to the one that he lives in Moscow. He opens the door, and the thing is, you know, this is a recently constructed space. It is a new construction, and it has the same typical standardized furniture that everybody has, so he doesn't recognize the apartment as not his own. He goes to sleep, he wakes up, there's this woman, you know, here they are discussing in the kitchen. She's very surprised to discover a stranger, and so, you know, the plot, basically it's a complicated love story. Eventually they end up falling in love and getting married, but, you know, it's a lot more complicated than that. But as you can see, you know, housing itself begins to be this backdrop for these kinds of stories. So there is a certain idea that dominates public perceptions that these things are all alike. There's only a very limited number of series that were produced, very limited number of planning solutions. But that's basically not true, as I'm going to show you today. Enrique has already mentioned a bit Khrushchev's plan to transform socialist housing. Just to also give you a sense of what was happening before Khrushchev came into power, you already had, after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, a severe shortage of housing because you also had a civil war. There were a number of buildings that were subdivided to house peasants coming in from the countryside. But during the Civil War, you know, in the winter in St. Petersburg, for example, you know, pipes froze. People had to tear buildings apart essentially to heat them. A lot of buildings were condemned, unlivable. So there was already a shortage of housing. With a little bit of rebuilding that started happening in the 20s and in the 30s, but you also have all kinds of financial crises in the Soviet Union. You have famines happening in Ukraine, so this is not exactly a time where a lot of investment is going toward housing. And Stalin is very strategically making decisions about creating new towns around industries, out in Siberia, out in Magnitogorsk, not industries, around natural resources, right? There was a certain schema of population control by not creating, you know, new housing in cities, but putting it somewhere else, and it tended to be very kind of barrack style and minimal to really be able to move the workers around. So really any kind of mass housing designs were not a feature of especially the Stalin era, right? They were a feature of early Soviet imagination, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of the avant-garde experiments, but very little of it was built. And Khrushchev's plan was to turn the situation around. Of course, after the Second World War, there were hundreds of towns and villages destroyed in the Soviet Union. It was severely hit. So whatever was already a very bad situation in terms of housing got even worse. So actually a lot of the experiments with prefabrication were already in place in the late Stalin period, in the late 1940s. The same people who came to be heads of the new construction industry with Khrushchev were already actually top figures there. But as Khrushchev came into power, he began to really emphasize this notion of typical designs, unification of design, development of cost-productive methods of prefabrication, and there was a very famous speech that he gave at this Congress of Builders where he basically said, we need to get rid of needless beautification, right? We don't have the money for this. He said, we are not against beauty, but against overindulgences. Is it acceptable that in the same city, Moscow, the difference in cost of construction can vary between 500 to 800 rubles per square meter of living space? So it's not even that, you know, it's some sort of an aesthetic program that he's really proposing. What he's saying is we need to build as cheaply as possible because we need to make a lot of housing. There were a number of other measures that were taken at the same time. So the Academy of Architecture, which under Stalin produced these sort of very ornate neoclassical designs, was reformed. It was renamed Academy of Building. was really very much a symbolic gesture that prioritized pragmatic aspects of construction. Architects really became kind of engineers, right? So it became a profession that was most closely associated with engineering. And I think those of you who were in St. Petersburg may have encountered a bit of that among the students, because I think that's still a feature of how they're trained, right? They're trained as engineers and as kind of civil servants and who are supposed to execute designs and things given to them without asking too many questions. As you see, the 5-year plan that was put in place was really supposed to create quite an awesome amount of housing in a very short period of time. And this is, I'm going to come back a little bit to this, but basically what I'm going to talk about is what was happening during this period of time that I'm describing, late 1950s, with the experiments in constructing these microrayoni, because that's where they were really beginning to be conceived, was dovetailing with some of the things that were happening in Soviet science. I'm going to, for the purpose of this talk, really focus more on explaining about the various features of the housing situation, but if you want to, probe me more on the science side of things, on the cybernetic side of things, I'm very happy to say more. And also, as we're talking about getting rid of overindulgences in architecture, I also wanted to show this image from a publication on interior decoration from this period of time, because here you also want to get rid of the same overindulgences, I can't say the word, in interiors, right? So this is a manual that's trying to instruct people on how to declutter their homes, how to get rid of knickknacks, how to get rid of all these undesirable items, and so it does come with a certain moralizing agenda, right? Now, to be a good modern Soviet, you need to have a proper interior that's fitting with the new style of socialist housing. So one of the things that begins to be very striking when you start looking at the Soviet discourse on housing at this time and what is published in various architectural journals is that, well, the shift between, once the Academy of Architecture is renamed, that shift begins to be very clear. Instead of having basically these ornate Stalin-style renderings, the key journals immediately begin to be very, very, very detailed about construction, the construction process itself. And they start talking about the science of city building. So scientific housing is something that appears time and time again, both in Khrushchev's own speech, in the planning institutions, in the way architecture is written about. It's a really dramatic and very quick turn. And basically what they're saying is we have a true scientific solution readily available to us. Architecture is going to actually practice a kind of science. Planning is going to be a science. And what this requires is a comprehensive analysis of all city-forming factors. That sounds extremely ambitious, that you can comprehensively analyze all the systems that go into planning a city, but they're also creating cities from scratch, from nothing, right? So this is also an opportunity to think of them as that kind of totality. What that means, practically, is that there's a strong emphasis on optimization of cost to quality. So when journals talk about optimization, where Soviet architects begin to talk about optimization, what they're essentially talking about is something the cost is a key consideration, right? So they're not only optimizing location, they're not only optimizing housing itself, but they're always optimizing it to cost. There's a strong call for nauchnost. That's a Russian term, and that basically translates as something like scienticity, right? So housing cannot just be left to its own devices, people need to understand it as a scientific problem that is to be solved. It also needs to consider new social needs. Now, as you can see, these apartment buildings are designed for individual families, which is a big turn away from the early avant-garde ideas of communal housing, right, and sort of these new experimental types of dwellings where people are not going to be divided into sort of these bourgeois family units. That said, however, you also don't want to fully concede to to the bourgeois lifestyle, so to speak. So there is this idea of, well, how much privacy do people need? Do they need individual kitchens? Maybe they need very small kitchens because kitchens are not going to be something people use because they're going to have public facilities where they mostly eat, et cetera, right? So spaces themselves, although these are individual apartments that they're talking about, spaces themselves are reconceived with a different social idea in mind. There is a huge emphasis on experimentality. Until 1955, there was no code of norms. There is no norms or standards, unified norms or standards, building standards in the Soviet Union. So at this point, they're really trying to unify all systems of construction, production, including, everything from, establishing the norms for what cement proportions should be like, or, what tiles should be like, to standardized furniture, et cetera, et cetera. They're always trying to do this, all kind of in one fell swoop. And something that I'm going to emphasize here, which is this notion that arises with the emergence of the Microrayon, which is the notion of a self-governance through optimized design. It's this idea that if you optimize all features of design, if you analyze all the city-forming factors together in concert, in some sort of a systematic way, in a scientific way, very mathematical generally speaking, then you can create these units that actually do not need constant input from the center, right? So the city administration does not need to be constantly telling or micromanaging these units. They're going to actually be designed in such a perfect way that they're going to function on their own. And before I explain how this dovetails with cybernetics, I think you can already tell how the self-governance through kind of smaller subunits makes sense in the cybernetic vision. I'm going to backtrack a little bit and mention that statistical administration was already a big part of the Soviet project. Actually, long before the Soviet Union even existed, there were these notions of how statistics is going to begin to be the main way in which this planned economy is going to be administered. And I don't know if any of you have read this very bizarre book called The Red Star. It was published in 1908 by a guy named Alexander Bogdanov, who's a Menshevik. He was a doctor. He experimented with blood transfusions. He tried to rejuvenate himself, and he died. But among other things, he was an interesting character. But among other things, he actually came up with this proto-cybernetic theory idea called techtology. He was also Lenin's advisor, economic advisor for a while. It was a very, very rich biography. But in this novel, which is, here it's called The First Bolshevik Utopia. I would say it's actually a little bit more dystopian, but perhaps I'll let you read it and find out. The protagonist travels to Mars, where he finds a perfect socialist system, perfect socialist economy. And his Martian guide is taking him to a factory and is describing the way governance, how it's governed, right? How the system of planning is administered. And he says, well, the Institute of Statistics has agencies everywhere which keep track of the flow of goods in and out of the stockpiles, to monitor productivity of all enterprises and changes in their workforces. So in that case, basically they can calculate how much can be produced, needs to be produced, and then they can also divert workers to where they're most needed. And so, for example, the protagonist asks, well, what if somebody overconsumes something? He says, well, statistically, it's still going to even itself out, right? Normally, you might decide to get 3 new suits in a day just because you're having that kind of day. But generally speaking, it's going to balance itself out. Nobody's going to need 3 suits every single day. So you always have equilibrium both in the way the system is managed statistically, but also in the way human behavior evens out statistically. So the notion of the statistical administration was, of course, key to Gosplan. The Soviet planning system was created in the 1920s. But this is actually a bit different from what happened with cybernetics. Cybernetics, as many of you know, was really a product of the Second World War. It emerged through thinking about mechanisms, self-regulating mechanisms on airplanes. Norbert Wiener in particular was working with the airplane technology. Here he is in Moscow. But it's a Neo-Greek term, which essentially means steersman, right? It's a tribute to the steering engines on the ship, which in Wiener's view were some of the earliest forms of feedback mechanisms. And a feedback mechanism, again, I'm sure you understand what it is, but just to be on the safe side, it basically is a mechanism that takes some inputs, can adjust itself to a particular desired input, right? It sort of, I think one of the simplest ways to think about it is a thermostat, which I discovered is a very bad example in Russia because of district heating. No houses have thermostats in them, so nobody knows what a thermostat is. But I think in Barcelona, this is still safe to assume that people know what a thermostat is and how it functions, right? So you set your temperature, and it has inputs, and basically the output is the system correcting itself to maintain a certain temperature in your house. Now, it actually has a lot to do with information, right? So input is information and processing of information, also cleaning information of noise. And of course, as we know, the second law of thermodynamics will tell us that entropy is going to be, noise is going to be part of any system. So really, this kind of feedback mechanism is there to regulate entropy, to regulate noise, to clean out the noise in some ways. So while in Wiener's view, he suggested that the field would really be a way to control entropy, he never suggested that it would offer a complete control over a given system. But in the Soviet case, that's exactly what they saw cybernetics as, right? It became something a little bit different from the more common Western formulations of what it was. Here's a translation of Wiener. Also, it happens to be 1958 when Wiener was finally translated into Russian. Before he was translated, there was a major ideological campaign in the Soviet sciences, whether or not cybernetics was an acceptable thing ideologically, largely because Lenin was highly critical of this analogy between humans and machines. He tended to really dismiss any scientific attempts to try to suggest that humans function in this mechanical way, in a mechanistic way. So mechanisticism is one of his terms and one of his critiques. And so when they're looking at dialectical materialism, which became kind of this major dogma that all Soviet science had to abide by, there was a long philosophical discussion of whether or not cybernetics would be okay within the tenets of dialectical materialism. There was a big fight about this, actually. There's a book by Slava Gerovich called, oh my goodness, what is it called? From Newspeak to Cyberspeak, which essentially looks at that early moment when cybernetics was beginning to be accepted in the Soviet Union. At first, there were these major ideological denunciations of it. The whore of imperialism was one of the terms thrown at cybernetics. It was one of the juicier ones. But it has, as with many things that are beginning to change in the Soviet Union with Khrushchev, so the period of Khrushchev's rise to power, cybernetics begins to be ideologically vetted. There's a number of publications that say, no, it's philosophically okay. It does not go against dialectical materialism. In fact, this is a really nice complement to dialectical materialism. And in fact, it begins to be so important that by the early 1960s, the Russian Academy of Sciences is actually kind of transformed through cybernetics. They form a council on cybernetics, which begins to be this umbrella to form, to unite all sciences. It begins to be viewed as a pragmatic arm of the philosophy of dialectical materialism, right? So they're no longer in conflict, but in fact they complement each other perfectly because dialectical materialism is very philosophical, and cybernetics actually now gives you the tools, presumably, to do all of the things that the Soviets want to do. And because cybernetics is about information and feedbacks, it's also applicable to any discipline, any field, any philosophy, anything you think about. There is a way to think of it cybernetically. So in the Soviet case, it began to be seen as a universal science of governing complex systems on many different scales. The form of this kind of governance encouraged automation of comprehensively designed systems, which in turn relied on standardization of parts, automation of production, optimization of input and output in order to maximize the system's effectiveness. If this is beginning to sound a little bit like what I was describing with governance in Microrayon, that's my point. So these cybernetic goals were generally articulated in the language of automation, standardization, optimization, comprehensive planning, and basically they began to be applied to all fields of Soviet production, construction, design, also in different kinds of scientific aspects, and later in their interaction with things like Soviet product design, which is actually one of the components that I don't talk about here, but that's a piece of the book project. Because from the 1960s forward, there was a program for creating these overarching families of objects, of consumer objects, like electronics, household appliances, etc. And as soon as cybernetics began to be acceptable in the Soviet scientific establishment and the Academy of Sciences, it appeared very quickly in various architectural journals, right? So city building and cybernetics, methods of optimal planning using computers. Cybernetics actually here is much less about entropy and controlling entropy, but it's really about using mathematics to design perfect comprehensive systems. Here the journal, the subheading there, or the heading there says scientific technological progress in architecture. So this idea of scientific technological progress is the mantra of Khrushchev's housing campaign. At this time, another interesting thing was happening, which was an economic project, economic reform spearheaded by Khrushchev. He wanted to overturn the Soviet Union's image as a dictatorship, right? So one of the key features there was a decentralization of the Soviet government. That entailed dispersing the industries, moving the power out of Moscow, and this was actually kind of sold to everybody, to the public, as an attempt to delimit, to control the wastefulness of a bureaucracy. So again, this idea of decentralizing in order to create these islands that are self-governing, right? So that you don't need to be constantly doing this kind of, what I was describing earlier in the statistical governance model, which you're constantly speaking to the center in terms of your input and output. But here, you're actually creating these islands, these subunits, regional councils, that are managing themselves for the most part. So these were called sovnarkhozy, planning decisions about where the Microrayoni were going to be built and how they're going to be built were actually removed from the center and were given to sovnarkhozy. They had to be agreed on the local level. That actually meant that if you are going to create a new Microrayon, you had to understand what local resources you had available to you. This was not, one centralized idea that was applied uniformly across the board. It was actually a decision that had to be made in conjunction with these local councils. And then once these decisions were made, they were communicated back to the central governance so it could allocate appropriate resources to do this. So this little overlap, right, that this intersection between thinking about the rise of cybernetics and certain idea of cybernetic governance, which is to take away, it's not statistical control, but it's actually controlled by creating automated subunits that can basically be their own little feedback mechanisms. I'm calling cyber-Sovietica because I think it's a cool word, but I don't know. And what I'm really pointing out here is this interest in comprehensively designed systems, interest in total system optimization, and a belief that you can actually achieve, right, that planning is a kind of system that can be optimized in that way. And then there's an interest in automation of subsystems through design. And with this comes the rhetoric of mathematical certainty, something that is still, I think, very much a feature of Soviet planning. I think, or Russian planning today, they still hold true to some of these ideas. And as these cybernetic ideas proliferate, as time goes on, this is already 70s and 80s, every time there's a recognition of more and more factors that need to become part of the system, systems get more complex, and here people begin to call for more sophisticated computers. When they don't get full implementation of more sophisticated computers, then they say that the system failed them because they didn't offer them computers and because everything could actually be planned on this expanding scale of complexity. I should also say, I didn't put a slide in for this, but I should also say that one of the projects that came out of the Soviet Academy of Sciences in early 1960s was an attempt basically to create the Soviet internet. And there was an academician, Glushkov, who's involved with one of the key figures in the Council of Cybernetics, who actually had this project of creating a system of computers, of computing centers in all these regions that would talk to the central computer somewhere in Moscow. This was an extremely ambitious project, very, very early, right? This is if Chile's project CyberSyn is 1974, right? This is a good 15 years before any computers were actually able to do this. And the project was, I think, abandoned in about 1964. There's very little known about this, but the good news is that there's a book coming out on it in March by Ben Peters, and then we can learn more about this project of creating these centers of computation. But I think conceptually that really maps onto this notion of trying to create this new kind of administrative landscape through Microrayon, and if they're also going to be self-governance through, there's going to be an aspect of self-governance through design, but also by the system of computers that are going to allow regional centers to communicate with the center. I think that really fits with that notion. So practically speaking, this is 1957 to 59. This is the first real experiment in this district outside of Moscow called the 9th Experimental District, Novy Cheromushki. Novy Cheromushki, Cheromushki essentially means cherry town. This was the name of the village that was there, and Novy means new, so it's New Cherry Town, right? So no longer the village, but this new Microrayon. And the experimentality here is that the Soviets, you can see the Soviets actively looking for what kinds of optimized ratios are going to be a feature of this kind of housing. So most buildings in this neighborhood were erected from brick, but not all of them. Some were partially, sorry, what's the name? Basically, there's an attempt to create prefabricated panels, brick panels that were prefabricated already and then kind of inserted into the facades. In other cases, there was bricklaying happening on site. In other cases, there were concrete panels. Right? So what they're trying to do is they're trying to basically use the site as a way to measure efficiency. What kind of surface material, what kind of technique we can use to optimize this cost-to-quality ratio. There are also several organizational schemas that were tested out here in order to determine the optimal ratio of apartment cost and level of comfort of its appointments. That goes down to the interior finishings, right? Some had linoleum floors, and others had wood floors, and some had ceramic tile, and they were just trying to really see what would work best. The idea here is to answer Khrushchev's call to try to create a single prototype that can be implemented in most towns in the Soviet Union. Of course, I was telling you earlier that local councils had to make some of these decisions, so there is a conflict here between Khrushchev's call to optimize this kind of housing construction style and then what happened later in terms of its implementation. So this is another view, a building that was with panels made out of bricks. And this is just to kind of give you a sense of the variety of modes of assembly that they're attempting. This is another framed construction. One thing that started happening very quickly as the Soviets developed what they called a vibro-rolling technology, where they could reinforce the panels themselves by rolling them through this vibrating system. I'm not entirely sure how it works, is that they started building frameless construction. So they would just insert entire panels, or in some cases entire building blocks, as we saw earlier. And when it comes to, there's experimentation with the surfaces and the textures and the materials, but there's also experimentation with the apartment layouts, because what they're also trying to think through is, well, we have a different kind of call to not have each family, everybody have their own bedroom. But instead, if you have a family of 4 people living in a 2-room apartment, everything needs to be flexible. The layout itself needs to be different, because we're not subscribing to this bourgeois ideal that everybody needs their own space and quite in that way. So I have a number of experiments with different types of layouts, discussions about what is more convenient, what is more useful, what is cheaper. If you are single, this is going to happen a little bit later, but there are already discussions about this in the 50s as well. If you're single, you don't need an apartment. Well, where do you go? There was a series of these houses of new lifestyle that were erected. And here you would have a lot of common spaces, right? So you would have a room, and you would have then a lot of common use spaces, kitchens, et cetera, more along the lines of what you would have seen in Soviet avant-garde architecture from the earlier period. And the idea there was that you would live in something like this, and then perhaps you got married and started a family, and then you would get an apartment in your Microrayon. So there's a lot of mobility that was imagined there as well. And as far as the kind of size and type goes, I'm going to quickly just go through this. Again, a lot of thinking about various nomenclature of projects and how you can expand them. The same goes for interiors and calculations of how to fit a table, how the door opens, and what kind of furniture you need, how much space you need for furniture, how you circulate around furniture. So the idea here, when you're talking about comprehensive design, is not just that you're talking about an entire neighborhood constructed comprehensively, but it goes down to everything inside the apartment, because that's how they really function. They need to be optimized in that way. There were in Chiromsky, there were actually several showrooms demonstrating the new kind of furniture and how it's going to function, and quite an interesting ideological campaign around about different kinds of furniture, because you would have to try to convince people used to something that looked like, whatever antiques they got from their grandmother, if that, that this cheap prefabricated lightweight furniture that was very flexible and multi-use, and sleeper sofas and things like that, actually would be something that they desire. The kitchens were rather minimal, but they were there. In fact, in this image here, you see a piece of it. This was, oh shoot, I did it again. This was a brilliant invention called the Jovian refrigerator. Is basically this uninsulated piece in the panel, and since Russia's so cold in most places, most of the year, you don't actually need a refrigerator. You can use this as your storage for items that need to be frozen. And prefabricated furniture, which was fold-out tables, things that were flexible, multi-use, and of course this was also answering another call, which was something that happened in Moscow in 1959. This is the American National Exhibit in Moscow. Basically, an American blitzkrieg of abundance, if you can call it that, trying to impress the Soviets with the variety of consumer goods available, from television sets to easy bake ovens to supermarkets, and everything you could really imagine. Probably some of you have remember this or know about this, right? This is the site of the famous kitchen debate between Khrushchev and Nixon, where Nixon essentially equated the variety of consumer goods available to political democracy, right, and the Americans' right to choose, saying that having housing types imposed from up above was not democratic, that officials should not say that all homes should be built in the same way. Of course, this is Mrs. Khrushchev, who is extremely happy to test the oven, and I quite like this image because she just seems downright giddy, despite the ideology and the conflict of two ideologies. This is maybe a sign of things to come and what happened to Russia afterwards. And with the construction of these Microrayon, also came a very strong ideological campaign to try to embrace new furniture forms. Right? I really like this particular quote, because the house is built, inhabited, you have housewarming, and you suddenly see the family move in and you don't recognize it. It's cluttered with old furniture. The apartment's unrecognizable. It became uncomfortable, lost its contemporary appearance. There's this big chest armoire that's propped against the built-in closet, and basically the users have no idea how to live in this new kind of space. So there is a set of design manuals that is produced by the government to try to educate people about how to live in these kinds of spaces. Sorry, I used these images already. I'm just going to go through these quickly, but this is to give you a sense of these design manuals to really guide people through how to live in these new apartments. But also, and that's I think something that Enrique was pointing out earlier, there was an idea here that is not just about prefabrication, it's not just about cheap living, but there is a certain people orientation that we often forget about when we talk about Soviet architecture. In this case, there was a swimming pool in the 9th Experimental District. There was also another, type of swimming pool with little walkways that was supposed to be part of this yard. Actually, the first publication on this 9th Experimental District, which was really to become a guide for other cities about how to build their own Черемушки, their own Microrayoni, devoted quite a bit of time to greenery, to communal gardens, to places. There's a lot of images of people walking with strollers, playgrounds, and other kinds of amenities and public use spaces. So this was really a major part of this publication. Actually, very quickly I wanted to mention this, but Черемушки, Cherrytown, the reason I spent so much time talking about this first experimental district is because it really was a testing ground to understand what these optimized forms might be like and ways in which they can be replicated across the country. In '63 there's this famous musical, which you can watch if you really are interested, it's called Cherrytown. It's really about, the future and the dreams, and this couple, two couples who move into these new apartments, and for them it's a big moment of celebration. Of course, there's like a little love drama involved. There's a lot of singing. But generally speaking, it's a very interesting little movie, and it's Shostakovich, so believe it or not. It's also quite interesting, sort of surprising musically. But here, I wanted to address with this experimentation that happens the replicability and the myth of uniformity, which we started today's presentation with, right? Because on the one hand, you have Khrushchev, and you have this entire call to rationalize and make housing mathematical, to figure out the optimized ratios. On the other hand, every time a new experimental form comes about, and there were many of these experiments, not just in Novy Cheremushki, but as different towns began to try out their own Microrayoni, everybody's a little bit different. In fact, if you look at St. Petersburg in that area that Enrique showed earlier, there are over 200 different building series that were produced in St. Petersburg alone over the course of 40 years. So every time, on the one hand, there's a call to create norms and perfect solutions and optimized solutions, and on the other hand, there's always something to respond to and something to deal with. So the series are actually very non-standard, right? Very few series can be found in different cities even. K7 is one of the few ones, the very first series is one of the few ones that really can be found almost everywhere in the Soviet Union. Everything else actually began to be very flexible and site-specific. So Cheremushki as a name were replicated all across the country, but they were actually very different. And local conditions played a role, especially encouraged by this Sovnarkhozy and self-administration put in place by Khrushchev, because, for example, if you're going to be optimizing production and say there's a bricklaying factory, in your particular town, well, does it make sense to continue using brick as the material, or does it make sense to create a concrete factory that will, create prefabricated panels? Well, it probably makes more sense to make bricks. So there was a lot of this kind of variety created by the specific sites. And I wanted to end today with kind of a very quick look at this very interesting town, which is it's actually a region, it's not a town, outside of Vilnius in Lithuania. It's one of the few Soviet non-architecture projects, so planning projects, that won the Lenin Prize in Architecture in 1974. But it's a region that consists of four, it's very hard to say on this slide, I'm sorry, the quality is not the projector is really distorting it. But it's made up of 4 Microrayon right here, right, so roughly. And they're connected by this serpentine main thoroughfare. So the red are the main roads. And this is a project that was built in a very, very hilly place, and with a lot of interesting, a lot of woods around, and there's a river, and it's a very beautiful area. And you can see that there's a real attention to the landscape. The architects are really paying a lot of attention to the way the landscape, sorry, this is going to be unreadable, but this is just placing some of the sites there. But it basically looked like this. They developed about 9 building typologies specific for the site, different building lengths as well. And then in the later years, there was another set of high-rises that was added to the site about 1980s. You can see that, there's an interest in also, it's not just bricks, buildings stacked, sort of boxes stacked in an illogical, irrational way, but there's a real interest in trying to understand how to create layouts that work with the landscape, and also how to create kind of this more organic total form in this district. A lot of interest in, there was public sculpture, a lot of public spaces. As you can see also in the buildings, there's an interest in creating some sort of inexpensive ornamentation. Each micro-district had, it had to be within walking access to daycares, so you had daycares, 16 daycares in the 4 micro-districts there. You had school, a major school in each one of the 4 districts. There was a regional hospital. And of course, this is all, the idea here is that this is all walkable. Just to kind of give you some more images from this, this is the place that I intend to go and study very carefully next, because this is a very interesting example. And just to loop things back to cybernetics, Lazdinai, oddly enough, also became the site of another very canonic and very well-known Soviet film about a little cybernetic boy. So one of the boys on the bottom picture is a robot, and the other is human. The human was replicated in this robot, and he is perfectly self-sustained, self-contained cybernetic organism. And I think that there's a really nice parallel that happens here, that the directors chose to film the story of the self-contained cybernetic boy inside the self-contained cybernetic Microrayon. So I'm going to end here with this quirky little tale, and happy to take questions. There's already a question back there, but yes.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I wonder if the academy. Do we need this? The Architectural Academy, when it was renamed the Building Academy, ever really stopped being architectural just because it became more scientific, and of course, scientific statistics is a branch of. It's a type of applied mathematics, and was it Leonid Brezhnev who said quantity has a quality of all of its own? And I think he was talking about housing, and of course, if building is normally associated with questions of quantity and architecture with questions of quality, we see that in some way they tried to kind of merge the two. I don't know. This is my kind of reading of this.
No, I think that that's, sorry, I'm losing my voice a bit, but so the transformation of quantity into quality is actually one of the principles of dialectical materialism. It has a set of strange scientific principles guiding dialectical materialism. That's one of them. So I think that statistical idea was very much there from the very early days of the Soviet Union, and Lenin's creation of this philosophy, also a philosophy of science and a scientific idea that he called dialectical materialism. What I was referring to there was, I think, I didn't really show images of Stalinist architecture because I didn't want to say that, you know, sort of Stalinist architecture can be represented by one or even sort of 5 buildings. It's actually very diverse and very different, but there is, as a whole, a tendency toward ornamentation, toward kind of this I don't even know what it is. It's really trying to pull from all historic architecture, right? So it's neo-historicist in sometimes extreme way. In fact, when the architecture of Stalinist era was imagined, one of the ideologues once described it as, if socialism is the culmination of all world movements, of all world history, then all world architecture belongs in it, right? So it can become this melting pot of basically all styles of architecture that ever existed and build on them. So it's very, very different. Visually, it's very, very different from its conception when you're looking mostly at Stalinist, it's called the empire style, the Stalinist empire style. I mean, it's normally visually extremely different. So I think when under Stalin you discussed architecture, you know, the architect was kind of this visionary who was combining world styles into this monumental thing that was the triumph of the achievement of world history. It wasn't sort of the person who was rationalizing human need and cost analysis, et cetera, et cetera. So while I think, you know, it's a very fair point that architecture, of course, is not just about what it was for Stalin. I think in some cases, in this particular case, it's such a stark contrast. In fact, you can see some buildings with Khrushchev's rise to power. You know, you can see some buildings that are beginning to, in St. Petersburg, there are a few, which basically at about half of the building, when the political shift happened, half of it is ornamented heavily, and half of it is just like extremely clean and austere because Khrushchev just said we can't ornament anything, right? So, so architecture begins to be something else in that particular shift from Stalinist to Khrushchevian, I suppose.
Well, I just wanted to mention a couple of things that came up in your lecture. One is that I didn't know about Lenin being against the comparison of human being and machines. So was Gregory Bateson, and he was very critical about all these comparisons, metaphors, trying to mechanize human being. But Gregory Bateson was deeply a science man and deeply cybernetic. Is one of the basis of cybernetics. So in a way, the sort of synthesis that they came up with in Khrushchev's time was quite along the right way, let's say, supposedly, and not so much ideological, but probably coming from an understanding of the reality of what cybernetics means. And the second comment was that I was surprised, of course, about the many efforts that were taken trying to educate society into a new way of life, into a new lifestyle. Of course, these efforts have happened everywhere, only that we are not noticing them because they are in the advertising all the time. But it was, for me, very clearly the same happened in Japan in the implementation of the major revolution at the end of 19th century, in the beginning of 20th century. Many magazines promoted by the government tried to bring forward the new Western, which meant modern at the time, way of life. And in that sense, the final result is a sort of mixture, which is probably our contemporaneity. The sort of, now these crossing messages are coming from all parts. We are crisscrossed by messages coming from many places. Mm-hmm. These messages were already there at the beginning of the 20th century or after the Second World War in these two examples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, as far as as far as the cybernetics question, it's a comment, but I'll go along with the comment. There were, even among the founders of cybernetics, quite a few disagreements about what cybernetics was about, right? So for Wiener, it was really a mechanism of dealing with entropy. So you don't need to control the full system as long as you can control it well enough to clear out enough noise from it so that you, you keep entropy from proliferating. For people like Claude Shannon, it was actually more mathematical, and it was much more about controlling the whole system. And there, I think, among these different approaches is also a different approach to this analogy between the human and the machine. Because in the sense, at its basis, right, there is this analogy between the human brain and the machine in terms of processing of information. Informational inputs and outputs are at the basis of cybernetics, and so there is a certain analogy between how humans process and how machines would process information, or how mathematical processes happen. That said, the level of reducibility or irreducibility of human function to that was a subject of sort of great debate among many. So, and it's interesting that Bateson did not subscribe to that, but Bateson was also one of the kind of founders of what became the second order cybernetics, which is cybernetics is more aware of the person as an agent in kind of this system of inputs, right? So you're not just a neutral vessel for inputs and outputs, but you're always a participant in this process as well. And so second order cybernetics begin to be, people interested in this kind of second order of cybernetics begin to be interested in subjectivities. What's interesting in the Soviet case is that they were obsessed with cybernetics. I mean, so many texts produced in cybernetics in the Soviet Union up until the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In fact, there are still people in the Soviet Union, I think, unlike anywhere else in the world, who would call themselves cyberneticians. But second-order cybernetics never happened, right? They never got out of this notion of total system control. They never got to the subject, and they never got to the subjective. There's still no mention of second-order cybernetics. It's virtually unknown. And I've asked around about this because this is an area of great interest to me. So I'm just rambling a little bit, but I think it's a very interesting point. And I don't know very much about what happened in Japan, but I think it would be good to explore why such similar campaigns for mass enlightenment took place. In the Soviet case, your popular culture is also the official culture. You don't have, well, there's some divergence, but it's still very much the government that determines, how many films are produced and what's out there and what begins to be what constitutes Soviet consumption. So if Khrushchev wants to create a Soviet consumer culture, but it's non-capitalistic, they need to start determining how to market these products and how to determine what products they need. And that's actually something that one of my chapters deals with in great depth. So we can talk more about this later.
For me, it's very curious, and well, it attracts me a lot. For me, it's curious and it attracts me a lot, the connection between dictatorship environments and these kind of atmospheres of cities and architecture. And sometimes this relationship between this kind of architecture, these products of modernism, for instance, in 451 Fahrenheit of François Truffaut, or from Ray Bradbury book. And why do you think, but it still remains, because in some publicity spots in TV, people still make this connection between modern style still and some future or ancient or future states of dictatorships environments in films and wherever. Where do you think there is this connection between this image? Because all of these origins, why do you think there is this connection? Because I think it's usual, it's common, it often happens a lot.
Mm-hmm. So the connection between modern design and somehow
dictatorship environments,
dictate to people how they live.
Possible futures with dictatorships environments and in this kind of lifestyles environments, or this kind. Why do you think there is still this connection with these kind of things?
I don't know. It seems to me that it's interesting because I've talked about Soviet housing in very different contexts. When I present this work, or themes related to Soviet housing in the United States, the question of consumer choice always comes up, right? So it's almost going back to the kitchen debate, right? It's almost like, well, if the consumer doesn't have a choice about what kind of house they built, then somehow this is not, this is a dictatorship. And then the other thing that always comes up is Pruitt-Igoe. And that somehow this kind of urban form is going to, be laden with all kinds of social issues. If I present this work in the Soviet Union or in Russia, then people tend to be much more interested in the scientific planning aspect of it. And the political and the governance aspect seems to be actually the least interesting to them. So there, people see this and they're like, but we can still design this scientifically. Wait a minute, we didn't finish. Like, let us finish here, right? And I think that just immediately shows to me a difference in the frame of the person who's looking at the stuff. For Russians, they were living in a dictatorship of sorts, but they're still seeing this today as a continuation of like a scientific vision, right? Maybe the form was imposed, but I don't know, like there's still this idea that like, look, if they were designed, if they just let us do, I had somebody tell me this, when I was telling her about my work on cybernetics, she said, I worked in an institute and they promised us cybernetics, but they never gave us cybernetics, right? So her disappointment was not in the fact that, this level of rationality is perhaps extreme, but her disappointment was that they were never able to implement this idea. And she thought that this was a very democratic thing, right? This is science, this is generated of the people. And that was the hope of cybernetics in the Soviet Union, actually, right? It was dialectical materialism was seen as like this kind of imposed from above, but if you're working in cybernetics, you could actually work on things that were forbidden. For example, genetics. Work on genetics was not allowed in the Soviet Union because it went against the principles of basically collectivity, right? Because if there's a Darwinian thing and some survive and some don't survive, that's not very socialist. So you had Lysenko and a very alternative system to thinking about evolution, inheritance of acquired characteristics. But if you wanted to work on genetics, you could sort of code it as cybernetics and then be allowed to work. So it's actually like a place for freedom and democracy, and rationality was seen as like a very free thing. Right? Like a lot of very non-government sanctioned people could function because they coded themselves as cyberneticians. So I think anyway, it's a long answer, but I think it's like the perspective we impose on, on what we're seeing here coming from our own backgrounds. Just for me, it's such a striking contrast when I present this work in different places and the kinds of responses I get. Does that kind of help? Yeah. Because it's, yeah. All right.
Okay.
Oh, Tomeo.
Yeah, Diana, thank you. I just wanted to know, you were talking about the thermostat and about learning and reacting. You were talking about that boy, able to learn and react. And I would like to know in which way buildings you are talking about and the Microrayon are able to behave in the same way, to allow changes through time, so to adapt themselves to the needs of the people through time.
Yeah, see, that would be great if you were thinking second-order cybernetics. If you were thinking, yes, these things need to be adaptable and changing, and then you would be on another wave of cybernetics. I think the Soviets were very much on the wave of, once you optimize it, it's good to go, right? Actually, Khrushchev himself said something along those lines, like, essentially, we design for generations to come, because once we figure this out, right, that's it. Done, right? Because all your needs are scientifically determinable, and so once we get there, we get there. This began to change a little bit in the later decades, and that's where things get very interesting. In particular, when in the 1970s and 80s, there was a strong push to build towns in Siberia along the Baikal-Amur main line, right? So there's a new Brezhnev's big railroad construction project taking place, and all these new towns around natural resources that are appearing. And there you had to really begin to think dynamically. So dynamic mathematical modeling is something they're looking at very carefully there, because they need to understand what they were calling territorial production complexes. So it's entire regions where housing and everything needs to be planned in conjunction with what's being produced and the triangulation of related industries that are in that region. So, for example, well, I don't know, but certain industries are often located within proximity of each other because they actually reuse each other's resources. So as they're beginning to plan these territorial production complexes, that's where the notion of kind of dynamic changing systems really kicks in, because they don't know if they're going to discover a new resource in that same region tomorrow, if they're going to need to readjust the whole economics of the region to suit that. So I think that interest begins to appear in the kind of later decades, but for Khrushchev, I think it's like, you optimize it. It's done. It's science.
Is it still lingering, this idea?
I mean, I think that's...
They are the best that could be made?
I don't think that the Khrushchevsky themselves, these buildings are imagined as very good right now, but I think that idea that, like... I remember the first time I came to Russia, I presented this work, and there's a woman who worked in transportation, or not this work, but something related to it. And there's a woman who worked in transportation industry. She was a transportation planner for the city. I said, I don't see the problem with cybernetics. I think it's great. This is exactly, you know, we had perfect projects. We had them all figured out. We had sort of all transport for the city figured out. But, you know, offices closed their doors and that's it. It just didn't happen because somebody didn't let the project go forward. But somehow kind of like these, there's still, I think, very much this idea that you can kind of rationally design everything.
Then this is one of the main problems to see microrayons as an opportunity for transformation.
Mm-hmm.
For
yep.
They were perfect, they don't work anymore. We have to substitute them for another perfect breed instead of trying to improve on the existing reality.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I just feel like emergence and creating spaces that allow for emergence is not a feature of Russian discourse right now, right? Sort of systems that can change and be created in such a way as new things can appear is just, that's not part of the worldview, right? It's somehow either kind of this capitalist free-for-all, right? Or perfectly planned. There seems to be very little compromise. Like, I think that's an opportunity, really, because this is an opportunity where people can really have their views challenged, but that needs to be somehow targeted, because I think it's like there's a tendency to be trapped between either the Soviet rational planning, perfect planning idea, or the capitalist in its extreme form, right?
Something very important there was that the people could go everywhere walking. This is something that perhaps is not important now, no?
Yeah.
That the government doesn't mind at all this. That the school was in the center of the microrayon, so like roots, no?
Mm-hmm.
And that it was a cell that worked, no? And with lots of little cells that worked by themselves.
Yeah.
And
well,
this
and
is
now
a very, yeah.
And now they're parking lots oftentimes because people just want to figure out where to keep their car, because that's such a... And it actually kind of amazes me as somebody coming from the US, because you need to have a car most places. You can't get around. There's terrible public transportation in most cities. And if you don't live in the city, then forget it. But I love the fact that in Russia, in Petersburg, I don't need a car. That's my favorite thing about the city. And I can't explain this to most Russians because they're like, it's a car. It was such a hot commodity in the Soviet times. Nobody had cars. So it's almost unreflexive, right?
They have forgotten something they had.
Exactly. So they had something really good, and it seems to just fall by the wayside because, I don't know, this consumer desire somehow...
Yeah, perhaps they only have to connect that cells, no, that work by their own, but that's all.
Yeah. Because a lot of these microrayon, they were planned as satellites, right? So with transportation established to the city, because it was assumed that most people would still be working probably in the city.
But it's a relationship from the cell to the city, but not from one cell to the other.
Yes.
But it's also a relationship that should be possible. And now it's not, well,
yes. It's an opportunity.
Yeah, it's the opportunity. It's a big opportunity.
I was told that Russians see everything as a problem, and then Americans see everything as an opportunity.
Another thing is that I never saw a planning of the landscape. I studied a little bit Kurkovsky, and I saw lots of plans, not buildings. I saw details, but I never saw the landscape, the planning of the landscape, this relationship between the black forms. And even I didn't saw plans of how to put that forms, no? They were different in some cases and others, but I really don't know why. No? Why were they different? And I didn't see planning, no? That you could follow, no? How they decide to change what is important. It's like, I don't know, with no thought.
You mean in the original?
yeah, how to decide, no? There was the school and how the blocks, no, decided to be in that position or not. I didn't see any.
I think that, so ideally, there was supposed to be all very much connected and planned very rationally. So there was a lot of discussion about, how to optimize these ratios and relationships. But then, of course, each locality was different, right? And each case is different. And then each locality confronted its own problems. And often there were problems in implementation or in coordination or something else. And so there's kind of the big plan, and then there's what happened on each individual site. And so I think it has to be looked at kind of case by case in terms of what happened there. But ideally, yes, they were very much supposed to be kind of this well-functioning organism. You look like you have like another...
Do you ever compare this to Fordism? Speaking about American and Soviet kind of models. I mean, Henry Ford designed this optimized automobile, right?
Mm-hmm.
In its day. You can have it in any color as long as it's black. And I mean, in some ways, it's not that different from what was happening here. And when we talk about second cybernetic?
Second order.
With more subjective input, isn't that a step towards post-Fordism? I don't know. Taking away the kind of, who's pulling the strings, who's making the decisions from at a higher level. But I mean, both were after kind of optimization, kind of economy of scale, and
right.
Many things in common. Even Levittown and North American single-family house production. Something can be compared to.
Oh, I think the Levittown comparison is actually is very interesting, and it fits in some ways and really doesn't in other ways. But yes, in terms of kind of the prefabricated, the construction, the factories basically producing housing, and then standardization ideas there, it sounds, I think, very Fordist, but there is so much variety in terms of what happens actually on the other end. As I said, just in St. Petersburg, there are over 200 series of buildings. It's like they actually, it's not like a Model T4. It's optimized and it goes everywhere. Maybe that was the idea, but the actual quest for that optimized form began to be a proliferation of varieties of forms.
Because you couldn't stop being architects, you see. They question constantly and reinvent the wheel.
I don't think so. I think that's a demonstration that it cannot be sanctified, that architecture cannot be reduced to a problem, cannot be reduced to a single equation.
I think that's exactly right.
There are multiple equations that have to be taken into account. Not only that, but probably we could see this experiment, especially at the beginning of the Microrayon, as a condensation of the history of architecture, trying to do as many systems as possible, as many materials as possible, in as many settings as possible. And in 15 years, they came up with the conclusion that a single model was not possible. So it's like condensed history of architecture in a way. Right? And on the other hand, I think it's the idea of optimization as a single. Actually, what I remember was that Khrushchev said, "We are not against beauty; we are against useless things."
Yeah, well, it's overindulgences, or it's not. It's more like overindulgences, but anyway, yes.
Like a caprice.
Yeah, but that's ornament is unnecessary, so it's useless, right?
Was it linked to some Western idea?
What?
Abundance.
Was it something against the Western capitalist world, or was there? Yeah, it's exactly that, right? Because you look at the American National Exhibit, and it's like, why do you need 400 car models? Why do you need all these television sets? You optimize a television set, and then you're fine, right? You don't need 1,000 different prototypes. Now, what happens, it's actually interesting, because in the later generation, the Soviets started thinking about families of consumer objects, right? They understood that electronics, for example, are changing. So it begins to be kind of a slightly different there's an institute in Moscow of MIT, which was an institute for technical aesthetics. They developed this field called technical aesthetics, where you're still considering all the scientific categories, but in a slightly different way. But it's still scientific, right? It's not consumer desire driven. It's not keeping up with the Joneses or whatever happened in Levittown, where you need to have this latest model car because somebody else has it. So in that sense, yes, it's very much anti-capitalist.
But also anti-Stalinist.
Yes, and anti-Stalinist at the same time. And I think it thinks itself, I think Khrushchev was very much trying to communicate a kind of a language of modernism, of European modernism at the time as well, right? That rationality was partly what made for a modern civilization and modern people. I'm trying to... I had a comment to something you were saying, and now I'm trying to think.
But I wanted to say that, comparing that trying to understand, to reduce the experience of Microrayon to just replicable model using prefabricated units and so on, is not understanding. That's why it's very different from Fordism. I think that, and that's why it's very different from the pictures I showed of Bay Beach south of Barcelona. It's not understanding the basic layer, which is connecting this with an existing urban fabric, with public transport, creating the public facilities, schools, markets, whatever. Also, giving the possibility of having some productive activities in the microrayon. These were not implemented like that, neither in levy towns in the United States, nor in our experience in the Iberian Peninsula, not in Spain or Portugal, under dictatorships.
Right.
So I think this is a very important aspect to stress. This is one of the main differences.
Right. Yeah, this is, when they say comprehensive planning, they mean they actually want to plan all the elements as part of a single system. But of course, I remember what you were saying, because I think that, yes, the scientific desire in a sense fails because it depends on what pieces you consider as part of the system. And if somebody else comes along and says, oh, you didn't consider, landscape, and you go, oh no, landscape, I need to think about landscape. And I say, oh no, wait, now in this, there are actually a few cases I looked at where there was a microrayon being planned, and then suddenly they discovered there's like oil in that region. And then, oh no, what do we do? How do you integrate this into the equation? And suddenly it's going to become a totally different kind of economy. And do we scrap the whole thing? Can we mathematically add this somehow to the equation? And what begins to happen is that people start putting a lot of stake into the future of computing. They're saying, okay, we can't really deal with all this data now, but in the future, we will have more powerful computers, and then they can process all the data. And that's where we are today, because, the idea of processing a lot of data in smart cities is exactly driven by that same impulse, right? As I often see, the ones that are the kind of the top-down models, not necessarily the kind of the more emergent notion of smart city. But top-down is kind of like the Soviet Union on steroids, right?
Yeah.
It's just, and actually I see a lot of that in that work on the territorial production complexes, the things that happen in Siberia in the 80s, where they're looking at dynamic mathematical models, and there are just so many complex factors that the planners try to figure in. They say, you know what, we cannot right now do this, but the best we can do is collect all the data we can and hope that in the future there will be a better computer that can deal with all this data. They actually say as much, right? So I think that just lays the groundwork for smart cities beautifully, kind of terrifyingly so as well.